Thank you so much again, and thank you for that excellent panel. I'd like to introduce you now to Yvette Arellano, who is the Gulf Coast organizer from Fenceline Watch from Houston, Texas, dedicated to the causes of environmental and racial justice.
They founded Fenceline Watch, an environmental justice organization which holds the fossil fuel industry accountable to the communities it disproportionately affects on the fence line. And I first heard of it when they presented on the impacts of the fossil fuel extraction at the Zero Waste Youth USA Convergence, and was thrilled when they agreed to present on the topic of Latinx and low-income communities who are paying the cost of plastic pollution. So thank you so much for coming and inspiring us about why we're all here and how we can all make a difference.
Thank you, Ruth. And thank you to all the speakers who went before me. Also, thank you to Young, who's with Zero Waste Youth, one of the first people who really introduced me and warmed me to the idea of zero waste through our Break Free from Plastics work. So thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and share screen. And I want to give folks a forewarning that some of the information that I'm going to be covering is a little more difficult and involves children. So when we get to those points, I'll make sure to once again remind folks that I'm going to cover those issues. So first of all, my name is Yvette Arellano. I live in Houston, Texas, home of the largest petrochemical complex in the entire nation, second largest in the world. We're home to over 400 energy industries, and over 240 of those industries are specifically dedicated to plastics production. Our community goes through millions of pounds of pollution on a daily basis. And in fact, this year has been our worst year for flaring. I do live in a fence line community surrounded by about 3 of those industries, one of them being Texas Petrochemical, Valero Refining, and Lyondell Basell. So that's just a little bit about me. My pronouns are they, them, and today we're going to talk about what are the impacts on Latinx communities or non-English dominant communities. So first of all, Fenceline Watch, we're dedicated to ending toxic multi-generational harm. I'm going to go ahead and pause here and let you know that I myself suffer from reproductive issues along with skin issues and some other chronic illnesses. So I really wanted to give that as a baseline. Fenceline Watch, we're dedicated to working in a multi-pronged approach, both commenting on things like the Toxic Substance Control Act to the Chemical Security Act. We do door-to-door canvassing. We are involved in direct actions, and we believe that we need all of these different methods in order to achieve success. Utmost for us is the importance of intersectionality within our movement. So we're not just dedicated to plastics and petrochemicals, but oil refining, extraction, exports, along with immigration, education, food sovereignty, mental illness in our communities. We believe that it's important for us to build our own counterbalance to an industry that has multi-billion dollars for press, for legal remedies. And we believe that we can build a future not dependent on extraction, especially in southern communities like Houston, Texas. So something I always start with in presentations is the importance of highlighting institutional and systemic racism, because it is due to these systems of oppression that keep us in positions of low power. We're talking about systems of oppression that guide our communities when it comes to housing and the environments we live in, to the poor schooling choices that we have that then lead to the prison system and these arbitrary prison sentences that are once again reinforced by these systems. We're talking about voting rights, financing and hiring practices that again keep our communities in systems of low power. And when I'm talking about environmental justice, it isn't a only people of color who are low income are affected. We're all affected because there's no way that toxic fumes coming from my community are going to stay in my community. But what we're talking about is the disproportionate impact that people of color who have low resources face, like myself, when we're confronted with the fossil fuel industry. And we're also trying to build those systemic solutions, trying to resolve the problems that have been historically plaguing our communities, like language justice, which I'll touch further on in this presentation. And then specifically to plastics, we shouldn't just be looking at plastics as a waste issue. Plastics is a fossil fuel issue. Over 90% of plastics are derived from fossil fuel products. So we're talking about the extraction in urban fracking centers like in East LA and West Texas. We're talking about the production that goes on both here in Houston, Louisiana, and again in California. We're looking at the point of sale. Where do these products, what do they go to make? The fast fashion, the Amazon packaging for 2-day deliveries, right? We're looking at consumption and then the waste that plagues our communities, both low income, people of color communities that have been historically placed in these situations, to the oceans dumping, and also how we export these problems to even lesser power countries and peoples. We're also very cognizant of the fact that climate change makes our communities extremely vulnerable. And it's important that we reaffirm how important climate change is. February of 2021, Texas experienced a winter freeze. So what does that kind of extraction and the production of plastics do to our communities when they're devastated, when these climate crisis events hit our communities, both devastating our food sources and also disproportionately affecting us because we are in such close proximity to these industries? What is the role of immigration, whether it's homeland security and being so close to these facilities that oftentimes also export this material? And where is the transparency with EPA and our state agencies? Because this is the reality of what we're dealing with. It's not just long-term everyday impacts of me walking from here to the corner store and then breathing in everything I'm breathing in. It's also these massive chemical disasters that often go underreported. Here's one. This is the Intercontinental Terminals fire of 2019. It started on St. Patrick's Day and it lasted about 4 days of active fires and then a total of 7 days of fuming. So this was a fire that involved 13 above-ground storage tanks. We're talking about the thousands of barrels of chemical content, everything from benzene heavy fuels to toluene to products that go to make polyvinyl chloride. So these don't just affect fenceland and frontline communities, they also affect first responders, where over 235 first responders met the call to action, arrived on scene, were exposed to chemicals that are going to forever harm themselves and their families by displacing the responsibility and economic opportunity of growth within their families and also our communities. We're talking about what happens after natural disasters, right? So at the bottom left-hand corner, you see 2 youths over in Baytown, Texas, in front of the Exelon Olefins plant, one of the largest in our nation. And so after the waters recede, people, just like during times of quarantine, are gonna wanna go outside, but what does that mean for our communities? For them, it means incessant flaring and the thousands of pounds of fugitive emissions that then continue after natural disasters have moved out of our areas, have once devastated our areas. Then we have plants and the exposures that they bring to our communities. And also workers. So this is once again the ExxonMobil Olefins plant in Baytown, Texas, just down the road, because our petrochemical complex spans 52 miles wide or 52 miles long. And the portion from here to Baytown is about 16 miles, which is the area that Fenceline Watch covers. So again, the tens of thousands of pounds being released. And what you see in the foreground are workers being instructed to go back into these burning facilities. These are the same facilities that are locking out workers during union crises that we're hearing in the news. And then what are the day-to-day exposures? So it's one thing to have a massive chemical disaster that is reported on national news, and it's another one to be in a situation like this person who's basically just trying to make a living, right? This is a picture I took out of my car after I stopped, and I just asked, do you know what's going on? You should really seek shelter, because this chemical incident from Texas Petrochemical, that is a plastics producing facility, went from the 13th to the 15th incessantly. And we're not just talking about legal emissions, which legal emissions do exist, right? We know there is a limit, a legally allowable poison limit for our communities on the fence line. So we're not talking about just the legal limits, but how much over these fugitive emissions present. So we see things like 1,3-butadiene over 57 times the amount of legal limit in this one exposure. So what happens when this exposure, again, is incessant? We're also looking at the proximity of vulnerable infrastructure. And this is where I really want to touch on language justice, because here we have two schools, Harris Elementary and Pyburn. Again, we're in Houston. Hispanic communities are prevalent. We're a growing population, but two schools, Harris having over a 66% English language learner population. They're learning English for the first time. Pyburn Elementary, 53%, and look at how those marrying together with economically disadvantaged populations. So we have the proximity of dangerous infrastructure that has increased cancer risk on top of increased respiratory risk for our most vulnerable populations. This is our future. This is what we're talking about when we're saying our future is being affected. And this is also what we're talking about when we talk about multi-generational toxic harm. Because what we know is that once children and even older and vulnerable population inhale these toxics, we pass them on to the children that our children have, right? And it's not just Pyburn, it's not just Harris Elementary. Here are two other schools and the problem persists. And ultimately, we're left in a situation where we have community members going into doctors' offices and we get blamed. We get blamed for our lifestyle choices, for our food choices. Never once do doctors stop and ask us, where do you live? Where do you work? Because if a worker goes into a plant, he's gonna come home, he's gonna take off his clothes, he's gonna wash his clothes alongside with his infant child, passing on those toxics. These are the kind of practices that basically normalize this kind of environment, right? And so it becomes so frequent, it becomes so normalized that you have images like the one on the bottom right-hand corner where we have our families playing baseball in the middle of a chemical disaster. And why is it that language is so important? It's important because it's a barrier. If I go to a public meeting over a fossil fuel infrastructure project, that could be a plastic producing facility, and I can't understand the basic language of what I'm being told, will I participate? Will I walk out? So that question is up to you. But language justice isn't just about English to Spanish. In the beginning, when we saw the colonization come and basically take lands from people, we saw folks like Stephen F. Austin saying, hey, you know, how do you expect people to be governed by a system that doesn't even provide translations? And so this was a contribution by a friend of mine who did extensive studying on language justice and has worked through the civil rights lens on this issue. So what is it that we're talking about with impacts of plastic production? We have chemicals like toluene that present us with loss of balance, headaches, irritation to the eyes, nose, and throat, vomiting, headaches, issues with the reproductive system, right? Again, multi-generational toxic harm. And toluene is colorless, so you can't see it in the air. Not every chemical will have a scent in the air also, so we're talking about an invisible danger. Here we have benzene, which is known to be cancer-causing benzene, but it isn't just cancer. We're talking about tremors and headaches, drowsiness and dizziness, so things you would associate with fatigue, but not chemical exposure. It isn't until you have a long-term effect at the end of life when you start seeing leukemia and anemia populate through our communities, and all of a sudden this is a problem that's seen. Now people say, well, Texas is also, and Houston specifically, is home to the largest medical center in the entire nation. It's one of the largest in the world. Well, here's a mother of four who is also a nurse at the Texas Medical Center, who understands toxic exposure, who says, we don't even have the information, right? We don't have the information to let us know when these toxic chemical disasters hit. This is a person who was forced to fill 20 jugs of water to brush her teeth, to take care of her children, to cook, to shower. And fortunately, she has that information when so many don't. This is a letter that is written by a child who's affected by legacy contamination, the kind of contamination that is left when the petrochemical companies are gone. And this is a problem we have to start discussing. What happens in a just transition when we finally succeed, which we will? The opportunity is there, the effort and the people are there. But what are we going to do after? We need to assure that systems like the super funds get reestablished, refunded, so the funds are there, and that fossil fuel companies are being taxed to assure that funds are available to us when we're finally cleaning up this mess. I really want to push your attention over to the second paragraph, which is a child saying, I just don't want to die. And let that sit. A child who experienced headaches, a child who confused a massive pool of toxic water for a lake because his community didn't have pools. So again, what does housing have to do with the environment? What does housing have to do with toxic exposures? This is yet one more intersection, because the impacts continue. And we're going to continue to be told, unless there's systems change on behalf of the medical industry, the housing markets, we're going to continue to be exposed to these highly volatile chemicals that, again, are going to migrate into our food systems, into our packaging. And I know there are folks working on packaging issues, but let's get to the source, because when the plastic is finally produced, it's already a problem. Again, ethane, most of the movement work I've seen have been specifically around ethane crackers. And it's important to encompass so many of the other petrochemicals that go into plastics production. In the chemical disaster you saw earlier on St. Patrick's Day, one of the issues we had were that children with special needs specifically were experiencing nosebleeds in our communities. We were told that it's going to be 10 years out before we see and understand the full chemical impacts of that disaster. And what does this cost in industry? The unpermitted emissions between 2015 and 2017 were about 872. And about 7%, here's Texas or EPA only really focusing on about 7% of that pollution, totaling to about 6 cents per pound of illegal pollution. So this is the cost on our lives, and why so many fence line communities request, and we're demanding now, cumulative research studies so that we can accurately describe what are those externalized costs. And just a quick note on Texas and California and why this conversation is so important to both of our states is because 1 in 5 Americans does call Texas or California home. And we have a predominant and growing population of people that are either poor or non-native English speakers. And so access is extremely important, because the American Chemistry Council and other industry groups are understanding the barriers and understanding how our movement is attempting to close those loopholes. And while we're doing that, they're requesting expedited permitting processes, right? What is it that language barriers, what is it that we're asking for when we try and talk about language barriers? Simple things, translation, interpretation, and we were able to achieve this in Texas, an oil and gas red state. We were able to achieve translation and interpretation for air, water, and waste permits. This includes the plastics life cycle. We were able to achieve a plain language summary to take all of the technical speak out of permits and allow for people, everyday people, to understand what's going on. We are experiencing a barrier where the state doesn't want to allow both short-term and long-term health impacts listed. And we need to engage populations, because if we continue to exclude non-English speaking populations, we're setting ourselves up. Ultimately, we need to address systemic problems with systemic solutions. It can't just be personal responsibility to reduce, reuse, repair, and refuse. And it can't just be oil subsidies and not here and anywhere. We have to remove barriers to increase input, to increase people power, because wins are possible. And this might be an extremely small win to you, but it's a massive win to me. As a child who translated for my mom at doctor's offices, having to explain whether or not she was having a regular period. Now imagine a young boy explaining this between a doctor and a mother, to advocating over utility bills. But this is a small yet powerful win. This was the first interpreted piece from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And the wins keep coming. We were able to pause a multi-million-dollar fossil fuel infrastructure project, the Texas Gulf Link Deepwater Project, and they were forced to reissue a DEIS. At the bottom right-hand corner is a virtual open house where every piece of information is translated, allowing for even more people to come in. Fence Line Watch was able to represent communities within our country and say, we don't just want translation and interpretation here, we want it at COP26. Communities and countries of the global South and indigenous nations should have translation and interpreters at their pavilions and through negotiations and throughout their experience at COP, so that they can relay the extremely important information over how their communities are being devastated by fossil fuels. Because it's not just a win for plastics. It's not just a win for waste. It's a win for housing, for immigration, for displacement of funds that are going directly to fund the police to increase communication. Thank you so much. My name's Yvette Arellano, and I'm the founder and director of Fence Line Watch. I really hope you visit us at fencelinewatch.org or any one of our social medias.
Oh, thank you so much, Yvette. You are such an inspiration to us. And it's so hard to hear, but so important that we understand so that we can make change and help. Yvette has shown us how the impacts of plastic production at their creation create multi-generational toxic harm. And we need to hear this, and we need to respond to their call to action. Plastics are also dangerous at the point of when they are released into the environment and incinerated. And we would like to give a little space to the movement that is helping to fight those incinerators, and would like to call up Gabrielle Houston from Gaia, who will share their new anti-incineration toolkit. Thank you so much, Gabrielle.
Thank you so much for having me. And I cannot say enough about Yvette. Such amazing work you continue to do, and the work you have been doing. It's just amazing. And as Bruce said, very inspirational. And I'm very fortunate to have been in spaces where you have spoken. Thank you very much. And shifting gears a little bit. Okay. First off, thank you all for having me today. And I will be talking about justice and organizing in incinerator and environmental justice communities. My name is Gabrielle Houston. I use she, her pronouns. I am coming to you from unceded Nissequogue land from Long Island, New York. I am the US intern at Gaia. As many of you may already know, Gaia is a global network supporting grassroots organizers fighting for just zero waste worlds where people are free from the burden of toxic pollution and resources are sustainably conserved and not burned or dumped. Last year, we announced our zero waste master plan, which was amazing and a great success. And this year, we are very excited to announce Gaia's Community Tools for Anti-Incineration Organizing, which is an anti-incinerator toolkit. And that is being released today. I will be discussing also some of Gaia's chemical recycling work on the website and a sign-on letter that folks can get involved in. So before getting into the toolkit, I wanted to highlight issues that impact incinerator and environmental justice communities, which is of course chemical recycling. I trust many of us are privy to chemical recycling, which is essentially the burning of plastic to be used for more fossil fuel or plastic related products. Gaia has been doing some amazing work in educating members on chemical recycling, including its many terms such as gasification and pyrolysis. We also have a legislative tracker and a ton of resources that can be found on Gaia's chemical recycling page. I also want to flag that the EPA is currently accepting comments before developing rules on waste gasification and pyrolysis incineration by Thursday, December 23rd of this year. And we're asking folks to sign on to comments written by Gaia on a Google form that I can share at the end of this presentation by December 17th. And so that Gaia can submit those responses as a group. And we're also asking folks not to share the form outside of trusted organization and allies. And I will link that at the end. So into the toolkit. So this toolkit was designed to help members and allies of communities burdened by toxic incinerators to organize against waste to energy incineration. It's formed by the experiences of Gaia members around the world who have mobilized their own communities and allies to fight for a world without waste burning. This toolkit contains resources on types of incineration, the history of incineration, environmental justice aspects of incineration, and organizational strategies and tips for community organizers. And to help organizers with their goals of shutting down waste to energy facilities, we also have a host of resources that folks can take advantage of, including key questions to ask about your incinerator, and also ways to find out the answers to those questions. So in the Community Tools for Anti-Incineration Organizing, we featured 2 case studies from Gaia members who document their own fight against incineration. First, we have BLARG. BLARG is the Brookhaven Landfill Action and Remediation Group. That is also a group I am a part of. This community group was formed in the spring of 2020 and became activated around the Brookhaven landfill that has been affecting the community for about 50 years. The landfill receives hazardous ash, or the ash residue that is a byproduct of incineration, from 3 of Long Island's 4 incinerators. The community around the landfill, which is North Bellport, has the lowest life expectancy on Long Island. And to fight back to protect their community, BLARG has organized protests, action hours, weekly meetings via Zoom. These meetings feature guest speakers such as Covanta, the owner of the 4 incinerators on Long Island, local politicians, other environmental groups from New York and beyond, other landfill community groups, and even trash haulers. BLARG has also began a composting program at the beginning of this past summer that diverted 1,200 pounds of organic waste from the 4 incinerators and consequently the landfill. And we recently completed a fall visual waste audit, where volunteers went to different trash districts in the town of Brookhaven in Suffolk County on Long Island to study waste characterization in hopes to bring light to the need for better waste infrastructure and policies to address waste reduction. And this work is ongoing. We're continuing to have action hours. We're also doing training sessions to educate more of our members so that they can take charge and take the lead on a lot of our programs and just spread the word so that we can empower the rest of our community to speak up and to fight for closing down the landfill. Our next case study is from Breathe Free Detroit. And the Detroit incinerator was constructed in the 1980s. And since then, residents and community organizers and environmental justice advocates undertook various campaigns to shut down Detroit's incinerator. In 2018, Breathe Free Detroit and its campaign partners prepared a 16-page report which covered the incinerator's construction and design, its services, including solid waste disposal, electricity generation, and steam sales, air quality impacts, demographic makeup of the neighborhood around the facility, and common health effects caused by incineration. And the report highlighted over 800 emissions violations in less than 5 years and ongoing odor violations. Going on, so some suggested actions including calling the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality to report odors, writing postcards to city officials, and signing a petition calling for the facility to be shut down. Gained some attention and gained the mayor's attention, the mayor's office attention, and some media attention, and a lot of press coverage. And ultimately, the Ecology Center, Environment Michigan, and local community members represented by lawyers from Great Lakes Environmental Law Center and National Environmental Law Center issued a notice of intent to sue the incinerator's owners for ongoing and repeated violations of the Clean Air Act through the rights of a citizen lawsuit. The lawsuit saw a court order requiring the incinerator to comply with its Clean Air Act permit and the civil penalties to punish them for past violations and to deter future violations. 5 days before the lawsuit was scheduled to move forward, the incinerator's operators announced that they were closing the facility because they could not afford to correct the pollution control issues. So now advocates are shifting their focus on pushing the city for a just transition away from incineration and landfilling, jobs for the incinerator workers, and the expansion of zero waste solutions to the city's waste stream, and efforts to strengthen communities near the now closed incinerator who are now facing incoming new development. And I will include the link to the anti-incinerator toolkit so folks can read more about that. And I just want to end with the last passage in the toolkit. Fighting incineration is long and often difficult process. It is also a worthwhile one, whether or not it closes a particular facility, because it strengthens communities and builds their long-term power. Transitioning to a zero waste world can only happen under the leadership of people most harmed by environmental injustice, and communities impacted by incinerators are a crucial part of that group. By joining this fight, you're making an invaluable contribution to a more just future. And to find out more information, we have our social media handles and more contact information for our Gaia team. And I will, of course, include some resources in the chat for you all to look at. Thank you very much.
Gabrielle, thank you so much for your work. Really appreciate it. And thank you for coming and sharing this exciting new toolkit. Now I'd like to call up Krista Tournay, who will be presenting our next panel on rethinking single-use plastics.